Good evening, everybody. I would like to thank you all for joining us here today for our annual forum event. My name is Kathy Tran. I am the current president of Equity in Architecture at Georgia Tech. I am pursuing my studies in architecture as an undergraduate and will complete my bachelor's degree this May. Woo!
Hey everyone, good evening. I'm Ben Mayo. I'm the current Vice President of Undergrads for EQiA, and I'm also an undergraduate student, and I will be completing my bachelor's this summer.
So first, I would love to thank each of our sponsors of tonight's event for their generosity and ongoing support of our organization. I would like to thank the Beck Group, HKS, HDR, Gambo and Gambo, AIA, EQiA, and School of Architecture. We'd also like to thank each of our exec members who have helped us with our exhibition, which is going to be on Gather Town, and it's going to be displayed until March 31st. And also for continuing forum conversations.
So who are we? You'll see the rest of our exec members come up throughout the rest of the event, but to talk a little bit about our organization, the mission of Equity in Architecture Georgia Tech is primarily to nurture community, create opportunity, and advocate for change. We're an academic, professional, and social organization dedicated to advancing and celebrating the work in our industry. And even now, in this virtual setting, we're continuing to grow with over 60 active members and are excited to continue growing our outreach through events such as this.
So I would like to discuss a little bit of our forum last year. At Forum 2020, Equity in Architecture hosted a discussion and investigated equity in a more active lens through the idea of show, tell, do. They showed us addressing skewed representation in institutional practices are essential to ongoing evolution of our industry, gave us a voice on issues of inequity, and inspired us to continue doing the work.
And for this year, we are going to continue dissecting what equity is like, but within our communities. So we're inviting our peers, designers, and non-designers alike into a collaborative effort beyond the scale of the individual and towards the goal of establishing equitable communities. And now Kathy and I are going to go ahead and read through our provocation, just to help reassert our hope for change that comes from this event. So to read from our provocation, in 2020, we witnessed a lot of systemic failures, such as healthcare inequality, police brutality, and housing insecurity, brought into stark relief. And with the government doing little to provide aid to its citizens, people turned to each other, turned to their communities, and found what strength they could. Where in previous forums we examined how social issues manifest themselves in architecture, Forum 2021, we decided to decenter our field and look more broadly towards the unique power of community. The importance of community resilience is not new, as it has always been essential for marginalized people sustaining themselves under oppression, but the need for it will only become more dire in the face of climate change, wealth inequality, and fascism.
We understand that many of the problems that plague us are larger than our communities. We must ask, when does a community have the power to solve systemic issues, or can they only mitigate harm? Where have we historically witnessed oppressive systems restrict the growth of communities under the guise of urban progress? Striving towards an equitable social environment is vital, and it's time to voice the power of collective action through community.
And so Forum 2021 will challenge our engagement with community, not just as designers, but as educators, students, neighbors, and citizens. We may facilitate the spaces where communities form, but they ultimately develop themselves. The multidisciplinary makeup of a community stems not from the individual, but roots itself in the complex relationships between people, place, and culture. So by opening the conversation beyond the literal what of a community space, let us examine the positive social impact that urban placemaking and placekeeping can have on the health of cities, socio-political systems, and above everything else, people.
So to discuss the schedule of events for tonight, we are going to have our student storytelling at around 6:20 or right after this. Our keynote will be at 6:30, another student storytelling at 6:55, our panel introduction at 7:05, and our panel discussion at 7:15, and then our breakout rooms at 7:50. Our breakout rooms recap and open Q&A at 8:05, and then closing at around 8:20 to 8:25. So to begin, storytellers or students in our School of Architecture that will share their experience that is the theme of today's forum, so about community. And with that, I want to introduce our first storyteller, Quinn Pham. Quinn is a graduate student in the dual Master of Architecture and Master of City and Regional Planning degree program She is a licensed landscape architect in the state of Georgia and received her Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from the University of Georgia. And she is doing work that is centered around the intersection of city planning, architecture, and landscape architecture. And I'm so excited to hear her story.
Thanks for the introduction, Kathy. To be honest, I consider myself a late bloomer in the community realm. For most of my early life, my idea of community was my family, my 3 siblings, my parents, my grandmother, and some extended family. By default, we belong to a larger local Vietnamese community in central Connecticut, one bounded by shared heritage and warfare. Yet our ties to that community grew frayed once my parents became divorced, which was taboo in that time. I myself only grew more distance as I assimilated in this country that was both native and foreign. We were a lower middle class family, which meant moving often in search of affordable rent. This housing instability only added another layer of difficulty in joining in community with others. By high school, I had changed school systems twice, lived at 8 different addresses, lived in 4 different cities and 2 different states. This was my norm, and don't get me wrong, I had a happy childhood, but I didn't have a concept of what community could mean. It was in 2004 when my mother moved us from West Hartford, Connecticut, down to Alpharetta, Georgia. The city's sprawling suburban form didn't do much to foster community either. But my mother's housing decisions were never centered around community, but rather on placing us into a good schooling system. She had worked hard to become self-reliant, and a community did not seem essential. The closest thing that came to community for us was Buford Highway and various international farmers markets. There was a comfort in blending in, hearing the familiar sounds of conversational Vietnamese, smelling aromas and odors that made us nostalgic for our own small Vietnamese grocery store back in Connecticut, and finding pastries that we used to have to drive all the way to Boston or New York's Chinatowns to find. You see, Buford Highway Corridor is rich in multiculturalism, from its residents, its businesses to its patrons, who sometimes travel from out of state just to get a hold of produce that you're not going to find in a Kroger. For me, Buford Highway is comfortable, and the sense of community really comes from simply being amongst others who share in the immigrant experience. You can imagine my excitement when the hashtag #WeLoveBuhai social media campaign first started in 2015 as a way to celebrate and showcase the businesses and people along the cultural corridor. I met Marian Liu, founder of the nonprofit We Love Buhai, in July of 2017. It was just days after I had left my full-time position as a landscape architect and about a month before I'd start my graduate studies here at Georgia Tech. I was hoping to use my newfound spare time getting involved as a volunteer. Besides my own affections for Buford Highway, I was drawn to the organization's mission of preserving the corridor's multicultural identity. Naturally, concerns about cultural erasure and displacement emerged as the area grew and continues to grow increasingly popular. Luckily, there was an opportunity to help with the Living Walls conference that coming September. I, along with a fellow landscape architect, Clara Kwan, worked on designing the layout for a night market event. I've always loved going to these kinds of cultural events, but it meant more being able to contribute in some small way. And I only learned of Living Walls, another nonprofit group, through this event, and was so impressed and moved by the murals that they brought to Buford Highway. Murals that reflected the immigrant narrative and experience that is so closely tied to the area. It was also wonderful seeing these 2 women, Marian Liu and Monica Campana, the co-founder and executive director of Living Walls, bridging their organizations and in turn bridging different people who shared a vested interest in Buford Highway, its past, present, and future. At this point, I had started graduate school and since haven't been as engaged with We Love Buhai as I would like. Since then, leadership has changed hands, but the good work in the community has continued. Throughout the pandemic, We Love Buhai has used its platform to promote the corridor's small businesses, as well as help to either organize or support COVID-19 testing sites and food distribution efforts. Back in August, I was able to volunteer with them at a food drive hosted by the Latino Community Fund. It is always so great to see different people who are seemingly unrelated come together for a common cause. This past year has highlighted the importance and impact of community. We saw so many people come together to provide support throughout the pandemic and to combat deeply rooted injustices that were laid bare over and over again. 2020 showed us that though we may be different in our lived experiences, we can be united through our shared values. Now, I'd like to close out with a quote from We Love You High's website. Through community, we are not alone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Thomas Bray. I'm the Secretary for EQiA, and it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Akira Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez is the Associate Professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of City and Regional Planning. Her research examines the politics of urban planning for the way that disenfranchised groups reappropriate their marginalized spaces in the city, gain access to, and sustain urban political power. Using an interdisciplinary and multiple method approach, her research engages scholarship in urban studies, political science, urban history, Black feminist studies, community development, urban policy, and critical geography, using both qualitative and quantitative data methods. This research agenda is particularly relevant to these politically unstable times where cities continue to marginalize underrepresented minority groups by defunding public institutions, promoting urban policies that subsidize their displacement, while limiting the affordable housing options, continuing to fund and support a militarized police force. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Akira Rodriguez.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen, of course. Okay. Thanks again to everyone here at EQiA and the forum, the attendees, the organizers. I know this is no easy feat in the middle of a pandemic, and I commend you for putting together a very well-programmed forum that I think is speaking to a lot of themes that have really been the subject of a lot of discussion and debate over the last year. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about community and equity. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of what is community, because there's always some dispute around these terms, thinking about the built environment as fostering inequity, but also thinking about the built environment as being able to foster equity also. When thinking about community, there's different approaches. First and foremost, you have this idea that community is about a cultural relationship, an affinity group, an interest that is shared, usually with people who are in spatial proximity to one another. Another sort of core component of community is the institutional support and the networks therein. And so some of that institutional support and networks are generated within the community, and some of those supports and networks are the community forms around them. And so the large takeaway is that these definitions refer first to people and the ties that bind them, and second to geographic locations. They remind us that without people and the connections among them, a community is just a collection of buildings and streets. And so while there is obviously, you don't necessarily need a built environment to have community, it can certainly act as both a liberatory space as well as an oppressive space. So we can think about that as well. I also like to bring up themes of spatial justice, thinking about how can we transform the way that space is created and that decisions are made about spaces and places in ways that are affirming towards just outcomes. And so how can we think about repairing harm from the past and restoring civil rights through access to how one's communities look, as well as the sort of built environment around it. And so how can we think about the relationship between communities, the people and the networks, and the built environment as being liberating and oppressive? What normative assumptions do we make about communities in our work? And also thinking about the normative assumptions we make about equity in our work. And so I usually feel that we think of communities as homogenous, and that is certainly a feature, is that there is some similarity within communities, like I said, around a shared interest or a shared location. But there is a lot of heterogeneity within these communities, and it can be difficult to understand how to prioritize and privilege those. But also thinking about equity and how often we assume that equity is just the goal and the outcome, and we're pushing towards this equity. Equity is also about a process and thinking really holistically about creating and transforming new systems and relations. Thinking about the inequity in the built environment, I have a couple of examples for the city of Atlanta, which is where I did a lot of my research on public housing. And so the inequity in the built environment, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these redlining maps. They've certainly been getting a lot of play in the last year. But this idea that land use and development patterns are creating this built environment of inequity, as we see here, areas that are coded blue and green are first and second grade, very high value, suitable for development, particularly single family housing, but also new commercial endeavors as well, often in the outlying areas, yellow and red, of course, being those that were downgraded, were not suitable for development, and as a result ended up furthering greater inequity. And so thinking about how can we transform the built environment to address some of these historical issues, but also thinking about how we move through these spaces. And so the built environment is also about connections, and the legacy of segregation in traffic and mobility in the city of Atlanta is pretty well known. During the 1619 project, in fact, one of the examples was about how traffic jams in the city sort of reflect these larger issues around redlining and segregation. And these are just one of the few issues that come up when thinking about how are communities being oppressed and how are they being marginalized through the built environment. And so how are destructive highways that go through majority Black communities and marginalized access to public transit and opportunity, creating both opportunities for resistance, but also sort of these initial oppressive conditions in these communities. You can also think about this as it relates to our green spaces and recreation. Of course, in Atlanta, there was a long history of segregated parks, Ponce de Leon Park here on the left, of course, having the sign colored persons are only sort of permitted as sort of servants of other sort of white clientele, again, in sort of this park that was one of the main green spaces. As sort of public parks became public, and there came a need to provide them separately but equally, there was always the case that there was not enough space in Black neighborhoods. Again, thinking back to those redlining maps where land suitable for development was not typically found in the city. And so you have this understanding that I believe by the time it was 1950 or 1960, if you look at some of the reports from the city's Metropolitan Planning Commission and Bureau of Planning, you'll find that for a population that was 40% Black and 40% white, that only 3 public parks were serving the Black community versus over 40 for the white community. And so thinking about these disparities and what that means, again, for opportunity, for mobility, for joy and leisure in the city, and what that also means for communities. You can also think about public school facilities, which don't come up a lot when we think about urban planning and architecture, but are critical spaces in terms of engaging and collaborating with communities. Public school facilities can create a great deal of opportunity and really anchor and center communities and stabilize neighborhoods. Really create a sense of community, but because of the historic relationship between property tax values and school funding, you likewise see these deep inequities appear in the built environment, again, as a result of these historical legacies. Things can change, however, and you can also think about ways of putting equity back into the built environment. Here we see a plan from WALT, the West Atlanta Land Trust, where you see the need to both incorporate communities, think about sustainable means of development, but also think about addressing some very real environmental risk. And so when we have these issues like we have in New Orleans, like we have in many coastal areas, but even here in areas adjacent to Proctor Creek in the Northwest, you'll also see the need to move people into higher areas and elevations to avoid issues, health and environmental risks that come from either frequent flooding, too much dampness, poor quality foundations, and a lot of mold. And so with this sort of process of prioritizing communities, affirming the right to stay, affirming the right to not to profit off of land and sale and property values, and not to exploit these sort of differentials in power that were created by this history of redlining and segregation. You create these sort of opportunities where you're both having this inclusive development that is also addressing a number of issues around justice in the community. You can also think about the long history of mobility, justice, and accessibility. And so when we think about issues of transportation and mobility, I have a picture here on the lower right-hand corner of Mary Sanford. Mary Sanford, along with several others in the Northwest, particularly in public housing, but in a lot of those same areas where Walt is working today, organized and sued MARTA with the NAACP in order to get that little spur line going up to Bankhead as a way to serve the predominantly Black population in the northwest of the city at the time, who were poorly served by transit access and were becoming more and more estranged from economic opportunity in the northern suburbs. Likewise, we see that organizations in the city, the Atlanta Regional Commission, are mapping out equity and access as it relates to issues around higher education, for example. So understanding who is being served and who is being centered. What are the outcomes of our transit system, right? Are we trying to get white, able-bodied men to workplaces from their residences, or are we trying to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to economic opportunity? You can also think, of course, about the very long history of green spaces and environmental justice. The idea that part of dealing with the built environment is having this really sort of holistic understanding of the built and the natural environment, and understanding how these things need to be in harmony, but also how they can foster, again, oppression and liberation that can happen in the built and natural environment. I wanted to return again to this idea of developing capacity and creating educational spaces. There are certainly architects that focus almost exclusively on educational buildings and educational spaces, and there are certainly architects and planners that focus on community engaged work and participatory design, but rarely do you get to see these two come together, where you are seeing both affirmative and outward-facing educational spaces of public school facilities that serve more than the K-12 spectrum and bring in adult education, alternative education, vocational training, maybe a public library or a healthcare center branch, but really solidifying the role and the space of the school in the community and in the community's identity. But also thinking about, just a standard placemaking exercise of teaching history and really creating educational spaces throughout the city. So thinking about, we have this legacy of inequity in educational access because of where one lives and the mobility and the routes they take throughout the city. How can we make educational capacity development more ubiquitous throughout the city? How can we make it as part of the natural and built environment? And I think these are some really solid examples in the city. One thing that I've been thinking about in recent weeks, months, maybe in pandemic time, is this idea that we need to start bridging the social and physical capital. And so thinking about community and what a community can really bring, I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of resilience, particularly around public schools. We know that resilient infrastructure, for example, is only as good as the people who are relying on it. And so you need really, really strong community input, community buy-in, and community trust in order to have an effective piece of infrastructure that allows the community to remain resilient, both for extreme hazards, but also for like the everyday slow violence. And so thinking about how many schools have been closed over the year, for example, and what does it mean when those schools turn into centers that are distributing laptops, distributing lunches, distributing all of the things that they normally deliver to children throughout the day in classrooms and making that really outward facing. So we get like a public accounting of what the school is doing for the community. And so this idea that you can invest in that school infrastructure to make it more adaptable to these activities, but also create that sort of concomitant social capital that comes with developing with and for the community. So a couple of takeaways and action steps I think I'd like for us to think about as we move into the panels and the breakout rooms is, how do we actually do this? And I can't say that I'm an architect so that I can give you a step-by-step. Even as a planner, I feel like these are sort of incomplete tasks and marching orders, but I do feel that it's helpful to know the history, right, of the place, of course, but also of the people, institutions, and networks. That requires a lot of time, but you'll be smarter and better for it. You won't kind of like keep putting your foot in your mouth, and you can start making use of the time so that so often the expert comes into the community with just their expertise. They only know their technical expertise. They may know a little bit about the community, but there's not this idea that there's going to be a collaborative learning and teaching experience between the community and the outsider expert. So really thinking about respecting the knowledge that is locally grounded and taking and engaging seriously with it as you would your own technical learning. Applying that technical expertise to local knowledge, again, to engage, educate, ally, cooperate, and co-develop. I find that my projects are way richer when I'm working under the direction of the community who has way more knowledge about not only like what data is appropriate to bring to a particular issue in the community, but also thinking about who to go to, like what are the kind of bottlenecks that'll actually impact that implementation. Also developing, again, this accountability and trust. And I feel if you do the first two steps, that will help with the accountability and trust. You do that through an ongoing engagement instead of just, here's a project with a start and end date, and that's it, right? There has to be an ongoing back and forth collaboration. Some other questions you can ask at the end of a process is that, how does this outcome affirm spatial justice for the community? What have we done here that is creating more access, creating a more liberating built environment for a community that has been marginalized, right? And then thinking also about the process. And so when you were engaging with the community, when you were collaborating and co-developing, how did that process also affirm spatial justice? What sort of tools and opportunities and new networks, what we call, the bridging social capital, in addition to that bonding social capital of just doing a community process, what was sort of generated there. But also, again, these ongoing relationships, how were they sort of strengthened and developed, but also thinking about those new relationships. And so with that, I'd like to sort of say thank you.
Thank you so much, Akira. That presentation was so powerful, and I'm so excited to hear more about your work during the panel discussion.
So next, for our second storyteller, I'd like to introduce Erin, who is a student in the Bachelor of Science in Architecture program at Georgia Tech. Erin was born and raised in Tokyo, Japan, and then relocated to Shanghai, China for her secondary school education. She has now moved to Atlanta, Georgia, to pursue architecture. At Georgia Tech, she developed her interest in architectural flexibility and resiliency, as well as international equity in urban and neighborhood communities. Hi, Erin.
Hi, Ren. Thank you for the introduction. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Eri Natsume. I am an undergraduate architecture student at Georgia Tech, and I am the graphic design chair in Equity in Architecture. I was born and raised in Tokyo, Japan, and exactly 10 years ago, on March 11, 2011, I experienced an earthquake with a magnitude of 9 that damaged large cities and destroyed the small communities in Japan. So this was later called the Great Eastern Japan Earthquake, and it caused major aftershocks and huge tsunamis that killed 16,000 people. And the aftershocks were very strong that it lasted for about 3 weeks. It caused a nuclear accident in the Fukushima nuclear power plant and that led to the radiation exposure and damage to most of the agriculture in the eastern area of Japan. When it happened, I was just 13 years old in middle school, and all the public transportation and cellular towers were shut down, and I couldn't call or reach my parents until midnight. I was feeling anxious and scared, wondering if my parents were all safe and alive. Despite my worry, I tried my best to gather as much information as possible and wanted to be strong to help support other students. I remember a lot of my friends were crying and some were vomiting due to the frequent shaking from the aftershocks. It was not surprising because we weren't able to stand while the shaking was going on, and all the electricity, water, and gas stopped immediately after that. Although Tokyo was not the worst area of disaster, since the city was designed to withstand earthquakes and other disasters. So eventually, the tsunami caused liquefaction to happen in the Bay Area, which takes place when the water-lodged sediments at the ground surface lose their strength in response to the ground shaking. But the urban foundation in Tokyo had saved millions of lives. So communities in Japan carry out evacuation drills multiple times in a year, and also the emergency announcements were conducted in Japanese and several other languages. So fortunately, many people stayed calm and didn't panic as much. I felt a strong sense of community because everyone wanted to help each other out. My schools and neighboring towns prepared bottled water and canned food for every single student and faculty, as well as the blankets to keep warm. My school immediately made the decision to let all students shelter in the school until the transportation recovered. Students who lived in Tokyo were mostly able to go home in the next day, although some students living in the neighboring cities had to stay at their school for more than 2 days before it was safe to go home. Later, my days were somewhat similar to the current pandemic situation of staying home and storing as much food and supplies as possible. So the Japanese school year typically ends in March, and indeed, most schools canceled their graduation ceremony that year. Fortunately, though, I was so lucky to hear that all my friends and family were safe and alive. 10 years has passed since then, but the reconstruction has not yet been completed, in which around 30% of the Tohoku prefecture where it suffered the most damage. In particular, the decontamination process for the nuclear accident has not progressed, and many areas remain restricted, which is preventing the construction of new housing complexes. But what is more important is that the people never lose their hope for the better future. We buy their local products to support them financially, and we pass down the story to the next generation to be aware of natural disasters and how we should prepare for them. With the help of the community, everyone protected and helped each other, and that made me very secure. By going through the hectic days with never-ending sad broadcasts on TV and radio, I still appreciated that I could be part of my community to support each other and hope for the quick recovery. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow. Thank you, Quinn and Aaron, for sharing your stories. I'm going to be introducing our moderators tonight, and we'll be going into our panel discussion from there. So our moderator is Lauren Marino. She's a graduate student and research assistant with the Urban Studies Institute at Georgia State University's School of Public Policy. She actually completed her bachelor's degree at Georgia Tech in 2020, where she developed an interest in affordable housing and equitable community development. Prior to beginning her studies at Georgia Tech, Lauren danced professionally with the Orlando Ballet. She believes that all members of society have a right to the city and that strong, empowered, vibrant communities are essential for a sustainable urban future. Lauren, thank you for being here with us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be able to be part of this conversation tonight. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our amazing panelists. So we've already seen Akira Rodriguez, who's joining us from the University of Pennsylvania's City and Regional Planning Department. We also have Marjy Stagmeier, who's the founder of TriStar Real Estate Investment Firm and also the president of TI Asset Management, which manages over 3,000 affordable housing units in Atlanta. We also have Terence Lester joining us today. Terence is a speaker, activist, and author in systemic poverty, and he is also the founder of Love Beyond Walls, which is a nonprofit organization that mobilizes against poverty. And then we also have Sonia Sequeira, who is our community engagement manager at the Atlanta Department of City Planning. And Sonia also has a background in public health and social work. So we have a really awesome interdisciplinary panel today, and I'm excited to get the discussion started. So to start off, we would love for each of you to go ahead and give us a 2 to 3 minute introduction into your work in equitable communities. So let's go ahead and start with Akira, followed by Terence, and then Marjy, and then Sonia. So Akira, go ahead.
Sure, thank you, Lauren. So a bit about my work. My work in Atlanta was looking at sort of the history of public housing as a political space in the city, and so thinking about how residents reappropriated the marginalized spaces where public housing developments were often sited, and using that as a platform to advocate for their interests and their needs as a result of that sort of disinvested built environment. And so the production of public goods and services in the Northwest, where we saw a lot of public housing development in the 50s and 60s, was actually a result of a lot of that tenant organizing, for example. I also do work in Philadelphia around public schools in a very similar aspect of looking at how educators and caregivers and residents and students mobilize around public school facilities. In Philadelphia, we have what are known as toxic schools, and so we literally have schools that have induced asthma attacks for students and have educators passing out as a result of toxic vinyl floors and asbestos and lead and mold and vermin. And so they have been mobilizing to bring their data in the form of their experiences and how they use public schools as a way of sort of dealing with sort of the technical engineering data that focuses exclusively on the facility's condition from a systems perspective.
Awesome, thank you so much. That all sounds incredible. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk with us today. Terence, will you go ahead and introduce yourself and your work, please?
Yes, so my name is Terence Lester. I am the executive director of Love Beyond Walls, and we are based in Atlanta, Georgia. So our organization has a twofold approach. We advocate on behalf of people experiencing homelessness, advocating that they have a voice, that they are humanized, and that they are decriminalized. Also, we fight for people without an address to have access to mailing system, identification recovery, and we also fight for equitable housing for our members of society without an address. One of our most recent campaigns in the middle of the pandemic was to provide sanitation so that our members of society without an address would also have the ability to have access to hand washing. We launched a campaign here in the city of Atlanta, placing hand washing stations all around the metro area. And now that campaign has grown to 56 cities all around the United States, partnering with organizations on the front line, serving those individuals who don't have an address but also lack sanitation. And so we believe that sanitation is a human right, and that if you are existing in a pandemic and you're required to wash your hands as a way of protecting yourself from the spread and contraction of COVID-19, that also you must be given the tools to be able to perform those behaviors. And so we are fighting for the equity, the visibility, as well as the humanity of our members of society without an address.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's great to have you with us talking about what we can do on the ground here in Atlanta to mobilize against homelessness. Next, we would love Marjy to introduce yourself and your work, please.
Hi, Lauren. So I'm going to step in for Marjy. She'll be in soon, but I'll just give a little introduction about her. So she is the founder of TriStar, a real estate investment firm, and president of TI Asset Management, which is an independent asset management firm and real estate advisory firm for international and domestic real estate investors based in Atlanta. But she also has a nonprofit that she started called TI Asset Management, where they manage over 3,000 affordable housing apartment units and 5 million square feet of commercial real estate and employs 30 professionals. So her work is really centered around community with her nonprofit work and working in lower income areas with garden apartments to create spaces for families to have after school programs with the kids and help everybody kind of have help after school with the parents and at work all the time and just building together as a community with food and education and interaction.
Awesome, Caitlin. Thanks so much for stepping in for Marjy while she gets ready. All right, Sonia, will you please go ahead and introduce yourself and your work?
Sure. My name is Sonia Sequeira, and I'm the Community Engagement, the Office of Design in Atlanta's Department of City Planning. And I work closely with Atlanta City Studio, which is our department's pop-up urban design studio that is embedded in different neighborhoods in Atlanta, really to give everyone more access to our work and have neighborhood level planning that people can come in, give feedback about, and really get to know us too, and have our team get to know the neighborhood. And so we were started in 2017 and started in Pond City Market. Then we were in Cascade Heights and are now in South Downtown. And although COVID has changed things a little bit, we really try to make all of our work transparent and accessible so that we can hear directly from the.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here. I've been following the Atlanta City Studio on Instagram for a while, so it's great to meet you. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start with our series of questions. So each question we've written to be directed at the specific panelist that centers on their work. So we'd like to start things off with Terence. So Terence, you've written about hostile architecture. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're referring to with that and how it can teach us about recognizing equitable and inequitable design?
Yeah, sure. Really great question. Hostile architecture, otherwise known as anti-homeless architecture, is a form of architecture designed to prevent crime, sleeping, loitering, and gathering in spaces where gathering is unwanted. It is also seen as a design that seeks to maintain some sense of order. This strategy of the anti-homeless architecture uses the built environment to discourage vulnerable populations from using public spaces for life-sustaining activities. Essentially, this type of architectural design says this statement: don't make yourself a home here, but also it says that you don't belong. Hostile architecture disproportionately targets vulnerable populations. It is a form of exclusionary practice in the form of design, and it also limits accessibility. Hostile architecture can also be seen as some things where there's bars placed in certain areas where that prevents people from sitting, or it constructs a wall or builds a fence around certain areas to keep people out. We've seen video footage and even pictures circulate on the internet where there are spikes in certain areas that prohibit people from sleeping. We've seen cities all across the landscape of America literally spend tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for boulders to place underneath bridges and in alleyways to prohibit people from sleeping. And I also want to quote John Ritter, who is a clinical associate professor at New York University, that says, we're building barriers and walls around apartment buildings and public spaces to keep out the very diversity of people that uses it, that also comprises urban life. I think hostile architecture within itself is a form of othering, which is a practice used to label people, to negate people's humanity or person's humanity, strip them of their dignity, but also create social constructions and social frames that limits a person's existence as well as their worthiness. Othering, we've seen all othering in terms of like social status and economics. We've seen people other with who have disabilities, who don't have an address. We've seen othering in the form of race here recently. We've seen othering in age and gender and even occupation. But this idea that a person or a group has no right to access the same life essentials that one may require from themselves. It also claims an unhealthy sense of power that believes that other people should be subordinate. It takes up the type of space and leaves no room for diversity or inclusion, and suggests those people don't belong here. And when we think about design, we have to think about the whole community. I believe that if you have an address or not, that does not mean that you're not someone's neighbor. That we should think of our neighbors without an address as people to engage and see them as people going through problems, and instead of criminalizing them and excluding them and seeing them as problem themselves.
Thank you so much for explaining that. It's definitely frustrating to see resources and time being mobilized to create such hostile environments when we could be focusing on building community. So it's great to have you here, especially with the work that you're doing to prevent this kind of thing from happening in the city. Our next question is aimed at Akira. So Akira, we have a critical need for affordable housing, and we know that the public sector used to provide it and that you've studied Atlanta's public housing. So can you tell us what equity looked like in Atlanta's public housing and what lessons we can learn going forward?
Sure. A very sort of complicated question, of course, but it could be largely because equity was never really realized, right? In public housing, there was the attempt in the beginning with the New Deal to provide housing for Black and white residents. So Atlanta had the first public housing and the second public housing for Black residents even before they could actually vote, as the white primary was still in effect. And so in thinking about equity, that certainly was an initial first step towards citizenship, and thinking that these residents who were being afforded their own communities, playgrounds, resources, electric generators, when before, the majority of their communities lacked plumbing, lacked infrastructure, were cited in these sort of marginalized communities. And so public housing in its origins did have some equity that it was allowing. It was creating a great deal of turnover into the private rental and home ownership market for those residents who lived in university homes, the first Black development. And that's not necessarily the end all be all, that everyone has to go out and get their white picket fence. But at the same time, for those who wanted it, this did provide that opportunity to save and build community, and also create some mobility. There is also, of course, the idea that in the 60s and 70s, when we started to see the war on poverty, the beginning of community action, the beginning of economic opportunity Atlanta, for example, we saw residents, go from tenant organizing to running for office to becoming elected vice president of major nonprofit organizations, as the case of Susie Laborde at Brady Homes. And so you see this, again, this ability to gain some equity and some control over the process and control over, for example, modernization funds for public housing, of knowing how to improve their built environment and improve their units. But once Nixon sort of implemented the moratorium on public housing construction and funding sort of dried up, the population became majority Black women, and increases on welfare income in public housing households. This all made it a very politically unpopular program, and you start to see equity actually taken out of it. And so there's wonderful things of public housing, the ability for people to be housed at the lowest incomes, the ability to have housing with dignity, but also the idea that you have to actually support that. People are going to fight for it, but you can't just sort of defang it as it was done in the city.
Yeah, definitely. Such an important topic. And I know in Atlanta that public housing has been completely phased out in favor of other forms of affordable housing. So it's definitely something that designers have a lot of stake in, and hopefully some of us can be instrumental in rekindling the public housing environment. All right. So Marjy, our next question is directed at you. So you've been helping to preserve affordable market rate housing by fixing up aging garden apartment buildings. Most significantly, you've partnered with local elementary schools to operate after-school programs in your building, stabilizing both the lives of the tenants and the occupancy of your apartment. How do you measure both equitable and economic success and the relationship between the two?
Well, good evening, everyone. The economic success is very easy to measure. I mean, it's dollars and cents. So it's very easy to keep a scorecard. From a social capital or an equity perspective, one of the things we do is as you mentioned, we like to buy large blighted apartment communities next to family schools. And we then bring in nonprofits. We have a nonprofit called Star C that does the wraparound community services, and they develop a very broad platform of resources. We've partnered with Georgia Power to do energy efficiency upgrades, which helps our residents save money. We always partner with the school system. So my last deal I did, which was 244 units in Southwest Atlanta, we partnered with Atlanta Public Schools, and the local school was Cleveland Elementary. Then we also create after-school programs in partnership with APS, and we do summer camps. Morehouse is our medical partner, half a dozen churches. I mean, the list goes on. Kaboom came and built a beautiful playground, which we had a lot of Georgia Tech volunteers there. It was wonderful. So the way we measure that is really through volunteer hours, the success of the school, the transiency at the apartment community, and basically the affordability of our rents. Our goal is to have rents that are affordable for people making between $25,000 and $35,000 a year. And usually that means we're about $100 to $200 a month below market. So it's hard to measure, to do social impact measurement, but we sort of have our method. And usually once a property is stabilized, it usually creates over $1 million in social impact every year.
Wow, that's incredible. It's great to hear how you are able to mobilize so many different aspects of community around affordable housing. So again, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us. All right, our last directed panelist question is aimed at Sonia. So the Atlanta City Studio was created proactively and equitably improve the design of the public realm throughout Atlanta. Can you pick one of your favorite examples and tell us about the process of community engagement and how it informed the design, and whether community members have remained engaged stewards of the project?
Absolutely. And so our work with City Studio has a broad range, and we also are working on a lot of housing projects, and so that's something that in our discussions in Breakout I'd love to get into as well. But as far as looking at the community, I wanted to look at our placemaking program, which is really examining what our public realm is in Atlanta, what our streets look like, anything from streets, parks, anything that is your public space. And right now, this is what they look like. And what we want to do is create something that looks a little bit more like this. So vibrant, full of people, really designed for everyone, ranging from those who are unhoused to office workers who work in the buildings nearby. And so this is all done through the placemaking program, which was started 4 years ago, and our community-led projects that the Department of City Planning and our studio helps with the design side and the implementation of it. And usually the way that these types of projects go are, there's a grant, we hear feedback, we do a master planning process, and then it's implemented. And this program is really trying to change things around a little bit. So how do we have this as a continuous feedback mechanism so that we can really hear from the community and test out tactical interventions so that if it doesn't work, we can take it away or we can modify or change one part of it. And so it's really looking at across the city, how can we work with communities to create more of a vibrant public space and distribute these resources more equitably. And so over the last 3 years, we've had 10 projects that are throughout the city that you can see on this map. And today I wanted to highlight Cascade Heights, which our studio was there for 2 years, and we worked on a bus shelter that was just across the street. And that's in this upper left corner. But if you look throughout, these are kind of the breadth of projects that we've had throughout the city. And I hope as you're exploring Atlanta, you get to see some of them and then you think of the placemaking program. And so Cascade Heights is in Southwest Atlanta. It is one of the oldest majority Black communities in Atlanta and has this amazing history to it and a really vibrant community that wanted to have a better public realm. And so it's honestly, before I worked for City Studio, I hadn't known too much about it, and now it's one of my favorite neighborhoods in the city. And we heard from the community that they really wanted to have a better bus. This is one of the most popular bus lines in the city. It's right outside this Family Dollar, and this is what it looked like before. And so we worked with the community to design it, implement it, install it. Fun fact, this was my first week of work, so it was quite the introduction to working at studio, but really fun and really great to see how it turned out finally. And then it ends up being this kind of landmark for the community. The community keeps it up. They provided the design input. They wanted it to reflect the nature of the area, and that Cascade Heights has a really beautiful tree canopy. And then they suggest changes moving forward with it. So it's this continuous cycle with that. And you can see the rest of our projects at citydesign.com/placemaking. And I'm looking forward to our breakout.
Thank you so much, Sonia. We've definitely seen the need for public space outdoors since the pandemic. So it's great to see some examples of community engagement with that. All right, so to finish out, we would love to do a lightning round and have each of you offer a small gem of advice to the next generation of architects for how best to continue the work of promoting equity and justice in the built environment, as you all have just shared examples of. So if we could just go ahead and go in the same order that we asked the questions in, that would be great. So let's go ahead and start off with Terence.
Yeah, sure. My gem of advice is to use empathy in all of your design.
Excellent. That is a great piece of advice. All right, Akira.
I would also just a little bit of humility as well. We tend to think that we've seen it all and we have our best practices and our expertise, but the people who have been living there usually know a bit more, and so that is always helpful to remember.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, Marjy.
My little bit of advice is to volunteer somewhere. Place yourself into some sort of long-term volunteer project and let that design you. So I got involved in the food bank many years ago. And my experience, I've been involved in the food bank for 25 years. I actually chaired the board. And that experience has completely redesigned my perspectives. And it's been great conversations. And I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if it wasn't for my volunteerism.
Awesome. That's also great advice. It's good to inject ourselves in the communities in the way that we can. All right, Sonia.
When you start any project, first think about who you haven't spoken to, who you haven't heard from, whose voice hasn't been represented yet, and try to listen actively to what they have.
Excellent. That is also great advice. Thank you all so much for all of the examples of promoting equity in the built environment, all of the examples of inequity that you guys have seen in the built environment, and for those gems of advice. And most of all, thank you so much for joining us for this panel conversation. All right, so I think right now we're going to move into the breakout rooms. So if we just want to go again in the same order that we asked you guys the panelist questions in, so starting with Terence and then Akira and then Marjy and then Sonia, if you guys could just kind of sum up what you talked about in your breakout rooms, tell everyone some key points.
Yeah, sure. One of the questions that arose in the group, which was very, very intriguing, was the notion of when you're actually designing architectural design and you're providing these designs on behalf of institutions, there's this sense of permanence, and you're not necessarily thinking about members of society that don't have an address. And the question then was, how do you begin to even incorporate some type of empathy when thinking about architectural design? And my response was simple. I was talking about design thinking, and design thinking is empathy, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And one of the most overlooked portions of design thinking is the empathy part, which suggests that we get proximate to the user, or in this case, the community. And I kind of highlighted how even in volunteerism, sometimes well-meaning organizations and institutions that want to do social good come in with these solutions, but they've never talked to the community members, right? They're trying to provide answers and they haven't listened to the cries, the hopes, the fears, the dreams of people that their solution is supposed to impact or help. And so my encouragement was to get proximate to community members, create spaces where you're not just inviting people to the table, but you're also going to other people's table to listen and get feedback and input that would inform how you bring the information back to an architectural firm or your group of collaborators to think about some of the things that may become harmful or damaging to those that you're actually designing without having them in mind. So that was my edification to the group.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that with everybody. I know I wish I could have joined all 4 breakout rooms at the same time. Right. Akira, if you want to share some of the key points from your breakout room with everybody.
Sure. We talked along similar lines of just how to sort of engage with these communities and thinking also a bit about what this moment sort of brings for us, thinking about the pandemic and lessons learned and changes that we could see in the field. I found that the conversation, we also just talked a little bit about pedagogy and teaching and learning during the pandemic and what that's like for some of our designer students. For me, it's not too bad with seminars, but when you need to draw and you need feedback on those drawings, I know that's more difficult. So, but hopefully we'll have more designers with a willingness to engage in this sort of accessible design of not necessarily having people come to these meetings and these town halls that can be kind of isolating and exclusionary. And so this could be another form of outreach. And so I really sort of enjoyed the conversation. I know, and probably Kathy can vouch for me, I'm probably like underselling the richness of the discussion, but I was really kind of having such a great time. I forgot I was supposed to report back. But it was really great conversation.
Excellent. Well, certainly a part of this forum on community is the community that we have here itself. So it's great to be able to engage with people, even in our limited online capacity. All right, Marjy, if you would like to go ahead and just sum up some of the stuff that you guys discussed in your breakout room.
Our breakout room, the people asked a lot of questions about the logistics of the design and challenges. So how do you deal with crime? How do you deal with code enforcement? How do you deal with structural elements and what designs built community? And I was sharing how our after school program, we developed a community center, and we just developed so much wonderful community capital by bringing people together and having tenant association meetings. And then I did a little short interview of every person in my panel or in my breakout group, just to find out what they're studying, what they're getting from them. It was really interesting.
That sounds great. Sounds like some really important information for all of our budding designers here. All right, Sonia, if you want to go ahead and talk about your experience now.
So we talked a lot about the role of Atlanta City Studio in each community that we're embedded in, what that looks like, who comes in through our door, and how we reach people who maybe aren't either comfortable coming to our storefront or don't know about us. And that's something that I think about a lot, and I'm always trying to have more people know about our work and come in and see what we're doing and interact with our work. And so it was really great to hear some people's ideas around it. And then also just how we can have more resources like City Studio across Atlanta, what that would look like. And although it's not feasible to have a City Studio in every neighborhood of Atlanta, what are ways that we can have that type of outreach for some of our projects?
Absolutely, lots of important stuff there. So I think it's time now for us to shift into our Q&A session. So for the attendees, we're going to be using the Q&A box. So if you guys want to go ahead and start thinking of questions and typing them in. But before that, we wanted to open up a Q&A for our panelists. If you guys have any questions for each other about the work that you're doing or anything that we discussed in this forum that you guys wanted to hear a little bit more about, we wanted to go ahead and give you guys an opportunity to engage in some conversation. And while we're doing that, if our attendees want to take some time to type their answers, we can go ahead and get those questions start rolling in as well. So do any of our panelists have any questions? Oh, go ahead, Terence.
I actually have a question for Akira. When you were doing your research for your PhD, when you were finding out all of the information, how did you stay motivated without allowing it to overwhelm you? Because many times when we encounter new information, it can feel like a fire hose or a water hydrant, and instead of channeling that anger or not anger, but like I don't know, just overwhelmingness. How do you channel that into something constructive? And that's the question, because I believe many of the architects or future architects will benefit from that knowledge.
Yeah, the work that I did in Atlanta was obviously very much archival, and Atlanta has a wonderful set of archives. I visited about 8 to 9 different archives in the city, and the history is just so full of wonderful stories that have not been told. But I did immediately go either to my sisters, who I would stay with when I was down in Atlanta, or like call my partner and like go on these like very long rants and these very long tangents. Like I'd get like obsessed at something that Charles Palmer from the 30s did that was, totally irrelevant, but it's like you need to kind of like vent. King, as they say, is kind of like learning out loud. So the more you kind of talk through these issues, the more helpful it is. There is a lot there. And one thing that you have trouble with, I think, is that, and this happens when you're doing any research, like you said, like if you're doing community engagement, you're doing research, right? You're collecting all these different data points. But how do you know like which one, like how do you balance them? There's really no way. Like I would get conflicting archival information all the time. One person said this, one person said that. The outcome was like a mix in between, or something totally different. So it's like three truths. And all I can do is just kind of present them in conversation with one another, because this is often, large rifts between tenant associations that happen because of like a misplaced piece of mail, or something that their kids got into like 20 years ago. And so there's a lot of things that are not necessarily irrational, but not all of your data points are always going to line up perfectly. And so I just think that, again, that's just part of like the humility and the empathy and the listening that we've been kind of talking about all evening. You just kind of have to do your best at presenting all of these viewpoints in equal light and allowing people to make those informed decisions. So there is, yes, any number, as you know now that we've digitized all of the possible information in the world, you can go down any number of rabbit holes just by watching TV. Start with the commercial, you Wikipedia it, next thing you know, it's like 3 a.m, you're like, what happened? And so like that is like a great thing, right? To have that much information and be able to absorb it, but certainly, making sure that you're not just absorbing it and ranting, but like absorbing it, presenting it, and allowing it to inform the conversation. And so, yeah, I feel like I just gave you a fire hose full of information with that answer, but that's how I feel. I love research.
Thank you so much for that question, Terence, and that amazing answer, Akira, as well. I know that was something that I've been confronted with in doing research on critical urban theory. There's a lot of conflicting information, and it can be challenging to digest it all. So, do any of our other panelists have a question?
I do have a question, because everyone here is in Atlanta, and I'm not. And so my understanding of Atlanta is it is a city that is very much about its growth and its image. And the work that you all do mars that image a little bit, right? Like this idea that you're being inclusive of people who, may not be these high mobility and high class individuals, and may not be the image that the city is looking for when it's putting together its story. Do you find constant resistance? Have you found allies? Do you feel like the Atlanta way is changing at all? Or I don't know. I would be interested to know about how do you find that your work is sort of received by those in power, and whether or not that's been collaborative. And you don't have to like go into details or anything, name names, be recorded, but I was interested.
I'll answer that one. So what's been interesting in the conversation I'm having around affordable housing and education is I've met billionaires and I've talked to homeless people. But what's been surprising to me is I don't feel like there's stigma so much about racism in Atlanta as there is about poverty. And that's been really eye-opening to me. There's a huge stigma around poverty. And we have lots of volunteer efforts at our properties. We have 8,000 volunteer hours every year. So I always invite some of our prospective investors to come volunteer, and they're really afraid to. But once they get here, I always tell them to bring their kids. There's a zillion kids at these properties. We've got these huge, wonderful playgrounds. You see a switch, see them switch, and just realize that, poverty is not something that you should just, pretty much the same. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that was a good move. I was just thinking about that kids thing and bringing people into that space to challenge those notions.
It's rare that people invest with us once they hang out with all those kids.
So I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're moving in that direction of we, as a city, have this motto, Atlanta being the city that's too busy to hate. And one thing that stuck with me is someone asked if we were a city that was too busy to deal with the problems related to hate, rather than our motto. And so I think, especially over the last year, this has been a time for cities to really examine their inequality on so many different levels. And for our department to be taking that on head on has just given me a lot of hope, even though I know we still have far to go.
Excellent.
And actually related to that, I had a question for Terence. So I lived in Atlanta for 8 years now, and I love the outdoors. And one thing that was always so surprising to me is how much of hostile design is incorporated into parks in Atlanta and into public spaces. And something that I still see of planters on a barrier wall so that someone can sit down on the edge of a park is really common. And do you see that as something that's changing? Is it still the status quo? Do you hear a lot of conversations around that changing soon?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. So I'm not sure if you are aware, but in January, I think January 16th, there was a city in South Carolina called Port Royal that actually had a vote amongst its political officials to literally ban sleeping outside, period. So when you think about this, there's a bed shortage, not just here locally in the city of Atlanta, but all around the country. And statistics are actually showing that the residue from 2020 will create a 41% increase as it relates to homelessness. So like you think about the people who were furloughed, the people who lost employment, the people who were evicted. There are over 8 million people right now that are 3 months or more behind on mortgage and rent payments. And so you think about the new cases of people experiencing homelessness. And I say all that to say is because we continue to see the rise of hostile architecture, and that's directly associated with the social constructions and the framing that we've allowed ourselves to believe about people who are poor. When we have these ideas that people are criminal because they're poor, that people are lazy because they're poor, that people don't want to work because they're poor. Last time I checked, there are people who are working 50 to 60, sometimes 70 hours a week trying to make ends meet. And there's still 20 plus states that adhere to the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. There's no county in America where you can afford a 1-bedroom apartment on the federal minimum wage. And so we have to really consider and rethink how we are viewing people who are going through this experience. And we must remember that the experience of homelessness is an experience. It's not a person. And so there are people who arrive into this plight from several different avenues. And I think as it relates to parks and spaces all around our country, we need more empathy. We need empathy in the way that we design ordinances and laws. We need empathy in the way that we create policy. And we need empathy, meaning that we need the persons who are actually writing these ordinances and laws to be proximate to the community that it affects. Because every ordinance and every policy has a story and a narrative. There's a hero and a villain. There's a solution and a problem. Who are the villains? Who are the problems? And we need to unpack that. And so I think that's a really great question, but we need to deconstruct the way that we view those who are have the courage to be poor in this country.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much for those great questions and answers and the discussion we're building. For the sake of time, I'm going to shift to some questions from our attendees. So our first question, it says, for Terence, a lot of conversations surrounding the design of urban space circle around the implementation of hostile architecture and anti-homeless architecture. But how do we design intentionally for people who may not have the same lived experience but still experience living without an address?
Yeah, I just think, for instance, there's a public park that when the pandemic was first on the scene, this space was used as a place of community. I think about the oral stories heard when people said, I miss the commuters. They were my friends, right? Going back and forth to work, and now they're quarantined. They're quarantining, and the social distancing is compounded on the social isolation, right? And I don't even like the term social distancing, because what we were asking people to do is physically distance themselves. Social distancing was happening to people experiencing homelessness long before the pandemic, right? And so this public park actually erected a fence around it to keep people out. It's a public park, right? And so I really think, as we think about what it means to have empathy, this word empathy communicates that you belong, right? That you matter, that you too are also a part of this community. And we need to be considerate of the ways in which people have to maneuver. If a person, accesses a park for some sense of mental health outlet when you're living on the streets, then that park needs to be open. When we put fences around places, we also have to think that we're breaking up communities, that sometimes people exist in these communities because they need relationships. One of the greatest challenges of the experience of homelessness is being socially excluded and not having vital relationships. And so we need to think about all of these things when we think about designing buildings, as well as implementing these structures to keep people out.
Excellent. So second question, which is not directed at anyone in particular, so whoever feels like answering, go for it. What are the biggest roadblocks to designing with empathy? Is it lack of perspective and proximity, or maybe a lack of understanding of the root of the real issues? I know, Terence, this is... Oh, go ahead, Akira.
I'm not a designer, but I can say something very quickly in that I find that most of my students just don't consider it to be part of their professional training. To learn about communities and learn, because it is like a totally different set of degrees, right? Like it is history, it is theory, it is, stratification, sociology, geography, political science. All of these things, usually we kind of couch in just like, oh, you'll learn that on the job. But we could take them seriously as actual skills and incorporate them into our curriculums more intentionally, so that students could be prepared. Certainly proximity is helpful, but I do think that it's just the limits of the professional degree of being 2 or 3 years typically and not having time for that.
Definitely. In that vein, do you think that all of the things we have now with the internet and social media have helped people have access to some of that education?
Like all things, it depends, right? Like certainly some people have been using this time to join every webinar and listen to every recording of that webinar. And others have just been like really and streaming, right? Like there have also been some good shows that have come out, right? So people are getting radicalized in different ways. And so certainly we find that the information is there, but honestly, I mean, some of my students have basic digital like almost digital divide issues. We have this assumption that like this younger generation is able to adapt to technologies and are capable of doing this work on their own, but they actually are not. I won't say that things are worse than they were when we didn't have all of this technology, but it's certainly not been the uptake in, oh, suddenly everyone's a Renaissance person, because we have like, MOOCs and all of these like master classes. So yeah, so I definitely think that you have to be intentional and you have to have a teacher. You can't just rely on people to do it on their own because they don't have the time or incentive.
Absolutely. Do any of our other panelists have a response to roadblocks to designing with empathy, how we can incorporate that into our design?
So I think being really cognizant of your own biases, everyone has them. Everyone has their own lived experience that's going to influence how you think about something. I really like the quote, "People can surprise you, you just have to let them." And that we often think we know what a community is going to say, but we don't actually know. And so trying to go in with the most open mind that you can, while knowing that you are going to have all of your own experiences, which are valid, to come into it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Marjy, go ahead. You're muted, Marjy.
We bought our property in 2018. I decided to have document the community conversations and interview 15 people involved in the transformation. Legacy tenants, drug dealers, police officers, school principals, and it really changed my perspective. As Sonia said, I really let those people surprise me. And it really wasn't what I expected. It was so, especially the legacy tenants who were living in a drug-infested, very violent apartment community, they really loved living there. They didn't like the crime, but there was a lot of dignity. So it was really, and actually I've got written it in the form of a book, and I'm trying to get it published now. It's sort of like Evicted, but it's blighted. The conversations and the interviews along the 2-year process. And it's really eye-opening to read those conversations.
That's great. I just finished reading Evicted for one of my classes, so I look forward to whenever your book gets published. I'd love to read it.
Well, if anyone knows a publisher.
Absolutely. All right, so we have another question. This one isn't aimed at anyone in particular, so again, whoever wants to jump on it first. It says, third places are important for people to build social capital, build networks, and create a sense of belonging. What do third places look like for people without addresses? How can designers make third places that strengthen our most vulnerable populations in a world with an aversion to poverty?
So one thing I would add there is I think that is the tremendous potential of our public spaces. When we say that they're truly designed for everyone, that's what I thought of when Terence was talking about the sinks during the pandemic, or a lot of times in Atlanta when we do introduce a new public space, the criticism will be around that people who are experiencing homelessness are there. And if you think about any public space in the world, it's not that homeless people were not there, it's just that all people were there. And so, I mean, it's tricky what it means to create that space for everyone, but I think that's part of that key. And on an individual level, one thing I think as designers or people who work in this area that we can take on is really trying to get to know people in that public space, because they each have their own story, and in making them feel welcome and a part of it, that is then creating that third space and community.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That question reminds me of a story. We were working with a guy who was experiencing homelessness. He was in corporate America, had a business degree as well as a master's degree, MBA, and he became homeless going through that experience. And so our organization was walking with this individual out of homelessness. We had to hire a lawyer. It took 8 months just to get his birth certificate, 8-month journey just to get a birth certificate, because you need ID to get other forms of ID. And so, long story short, he overcomes homelessness. He's back in corporate America. He's stable again, etc. And we invited him out to give a talk at the launching of a museum that we created called Dignity Museum. And he says this quote, I'll never forget it. He says, when I used to sit in front of the coffee shop, people would come up to me and even call the police on me. He said the only thing that I had to do was change my clothes, and now people mistake me for owning the place. But he says this, he says, I'm the same person, nothing ever changed. And I think it's so profound in what he was trying to communicate, that we associate worth based upon extrinsic things and not necessarily the inherent dignity that everybody embodies and carries. And I think we need to see members of society without an address as also having that same inherent worth and value that we all claim for ourselves. That people are people, as my sister just said, and we need to disassociate labels because labels limit.
Absolutely, and what a powerful answer. I think it looks like we're nearing the end of our time for our Q&A. Kathy, do we have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right, so the last question, I think it adds on to the first one that was aimed at Terence. So this person says, for example, many architects, designers, and city planners have actively tried to take steps towards disincentivizing the automobile, but for many that may be home. How do we walk that line of being empathetic to the layered experience of living without an address while pursuing green design?
Yeah, there's definitely those tensions that exist in trying to, this is like a big issue with sustainability and affordability, upfront costs, the skills of the labor force who can provide sustainable housing. All of these things are super difficult. You have these concepts of green gentrification, for example, that, you know, implementing these things will create some forms of displacement. But I just think that we need to start at like the bare minimum, right? Like we can be kind of anti-car and we can provide housing for all, right? And I'm not even trying to be anti-car because we don't have any infrastructure in our rural areas or even our suburbs or even our cities to do that. And so we tend to want that, like that goal, and don't think about all of those equity implications in that process. And so of course that's going to be quite harmful. It's, you know, issues around modular homes and mobile homes and kind of the marginalization of that as well. Here in Philly, we have a ton of people doing, I just learned this, a ton of people doing 3D and modular construction. It's like, yes, low cost, yay. But they, the loophole is that they have to follow a building code from like 12 years ago that is like less safe and not as sustainable as like what we have now. And so, you know, you're in these like rock and hard places, but people need to have all of this data up front, right? We need to see both the harms of the cars, but also the lack of affordable housing. Like all of these things need to be in conversation.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to take a shot at answering that one before we go ahead and close out? Maybe not. I know it's a tough one. I think that Akira has definitely done a great job of emphasizing all of the intersections of things that we have to consider, as well as, you know, the transition areas with where we are and where we want to be, that we can't just snap our fingers and everything kind of comes together as quickly as we would want. That is actually the last question, so I'm glad that we had time to get through everybody's. And thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses. I know it can be tough when things kind of come in on the spot, but I certainly enjoyed hearing everyone's response. they're very well crafted. So thank you guys so much.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Paula Santiago. I'm the marketing chair at Equity in Architecture at Georgia Tech. And we wanted to take a picture of the whole group before we close the event, a virtual picture. Kathy, are you available to shake? Perfect. Please, if all the executive board, they could come and turn on their, thank you, their videos. That's great. Okay, so let's see in 1, 2, and 3. There we go. If everyone else wants to take one screenshot, please do so and send it to me. I'll gather them up. Okay, so on behalf of Georgia Tech's Equity in Architecture Executive Board, I would like to express our gratitude to all of you who joined today's discussion and spoke about the different complexities communities face and their evident power and resilient nature. We would like to thank keynote speaker Akira Rodriguez, our speakers Sonia Sequeira, Terence and Marjy Stagmeier for separating some of their professional time to share their experiences and knowledge regarding equity, design, and spatial justice. Thank you, Lauren, for being an incredible moderator in this year's forum. And also our storytellers, Quinn and Ari, for your honest and inspiring words. We would also like to thank our sponsors, EQiA, HDR, Gamble & Gamble Architects, the Beck Group, Equity in Architecture Georgia, and Georgia Tech School of Architecture for supporting and making Forum 2021 possible. And last but not least, a huge recognition to our incredible coaches, Ellen Donahan-Jones and Julie Kim, for guiding us and instructing us throughout this event from start to finish. We hope that this conversation continues in the pursuit of a better urban planification and a harmonious nexus between the built environment and society. This event has been recorded and will be found in our organization's website, EQiAGT.com, in the following days. So, well, everyone, we have done it. We have concluded Forum 2021. We all hope you have a wonderful rest of the night, and until next time. Bye-bye, everyone.